This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I look at the worst cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst land destruction cards in Magic. Land destruction can be a powerful strategy, as it allows you to directly attack the game's most important resource: mana. There are tons of powerful land destruction cards out there, so many that I have done an MTG Top 10 on them. But there are also lots of really bad land destruction spells out there. In fact, the vast majority of land destruction cards are just bad. Land destruction's biggest flaw is the fact that you don't actually impact the part of the board that tends to matter the most: your opponent's other permanents, like their creatures. So, for example, if you spend a turn blowing up a land and your opponent has 2 creatures in play, you're going to be in for some serious problems. This means that land destruction has to be something that you can do in the early stages of the game in most cases, for it to be useful, but most land destruction spells simply don't fall into that category. As usual, for a card to show up on this list, it has to be bad in all 3 of Magic's main play modes. This includes 60 card Constructed, 40 card Limited, and 99 card Commander. It also has to have been bad since the card made its debut. In other words, for a card to appear on this list, it has to be bad everywhere, and it has to have been bad for all of its history. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the ability to destroy at least 1 land. In all, there were 217 cards eligible for this video, and in it we'll look at the worst 10 of the bunch. At number 10, I have Fire Snake. This starts out with a horrible stat line as a 5-mana 3/1, but it does destroy a land when it dies. Unfortunately, this means you have to do a little bit of work to get it to actually destroy a land. Sure, if you can find a way to trade it with a meaningful creature and destroy a land with it, it won't feel like the worst thing ever. But a 3/1 isn't that good at trading with something meaningful, thanks to that incredibly low toughness. And usually by the time the snake can take down a land, you're at a point in the game where destroying one probably doesn't matter. At number 9, it is Keldon Arsonist. This 3-mana 1/1 can destroy an opposing land for only a single generic mana. It doesn't even have to tap. Of course, you also have to sacrifice 2 of your own lands to do it, which really makes that a heck of a lot less impressive. This means that you have to 2-for-1 yourself to destroy lands, which is pretty brutal. It simply isn't an ability that is usually worth using. You can definitely find ways to make the cost of sacrificing lands less painful, but that's a lot of work for an effect that has such a miserable floor. At number 8, it is Seismic Mage. This is another land destruction creature that has a horrible stat line. This one is the worst of the bunch because it's a 4-mana 1/1. The Mage is a spell shaper, which I think was actually a pretty interesting creature type that has mostly only appeared in Masks block. Creatures with the type have an activated ability where you pay some amount of mana and discard a card for an effect from a fairly iconic Magic card. In the case of Seismic Mage, it effectively lets you cast Stone Rain with its ability. Unfortunately, this means you end up spending 7 mana and use up at least 1 card before you destroy your first land, and that is miserable. The Mage does have the upside of providing repeatable land destruction, and it can even help you discard stuff you want to discard, but don't forget that it also has a completely miserable stat line that makes its body fragile at worst and irrelevant on most board states. As bad as these first 3 cards were, they do all actually impact the board in a somewhat meaningful way, simply by virtue of being creatures. The remaining cards in this list don't even have the dubious upside of being super inefficient creatures. At number 7, it is Uncontrolled Infestation. This aura costs 1 generic and a red, and it can only enchant a non-basic land. That already makes this more narrow than most land destruction effects, but hey, at least it only costs 2 mana. Surely, it's efficient enough that it being narrow is fine, right? Well, obviously the answer is no, because it's on this list. When the land it enchants becomes tapped, that land gets destroyed. At first glance, that might not seem terrible. For 2 mana, you get to destroy a land. That's a great deal. But there's a big problem. Once you cast this, your opponent still gets to use the land you enchanted 1 more time. That severely weakens the effectiveness of a card that is meant to destroy lands, because it means you aren't actually hampering your opponent's mana development on their next turn, and that's kind of what you want to do with land destruction. It will usually set their mana back a turn later, but that's just not enough. Even if this could enchant any land, it wouldn't be a good card, so the fact it can only hit non-basic basic lands makes it terrible. At number 6, I've included two cards because they're so similar, Reign of Rust and Victorious Destruction. Both of them cost 5 mana and destroy either a land or an artifact. While having modality can be nice, you're really overpaying for it here. 5 mana is too much for destroying either of those permanent types, so the fact that this can let you destroy one or the other doesn't really do enough to move the needle. It is particularly funny to compare these two cards to Pillage. Anyway, these cards do have some additional upside. Reign of Rust comes with Entwine, so if you really want a good deal, you can spend 9 mana to destroy both an artifact and a land. If you're spending that much mana on something, you better be doing something very, very real, and that effect doesn't get there. The card is bad on 5 and bad on 9, but hey, at least Reign of Rust is an instant. Victorious Destruction is probably even worse because it's a sorcery. The only upside it brings to the table is that it makes the destroyed permanent's controller lose one whole life. So yeah, these are both incredibly overcosted land destruction spells that will virtually always have a minimal impact on the board. At number 5, I have Steam Vines. This is another aura that can destroy a land it enchants. In this case, you pay 1 generic and 2 red and stick it on a land, and when that land becomes tapped, it gets destroyed and does 1 damage to that land's controller. Then, the player whose land got destroyed gets to put Steam Vines on another land, so it has the same problem as Uncontrolled Infestation, where it lets your opponent use that land once, which already makes for a pretty bad card, but it gets even worse when your opponent can then stick it on your lands once they lose theirs. And sure, this does mean you can keep going after opposing lands with it too, but you're going to be losing land and life in the process for a very weak effect. At number 4, I have Cleansing. This sorcery costs 3 white mana, and it can destroy every single land on the battlefield, except it basically never does that. For each land in play, that land gets destroyed unless any player pays 1 life. In other words, this is mostly a burn spell that affects everyone. Typically, this will only destroy lands that players don't really care about. Sure, maybe someone's life is low enough that you can really cripple them, but if that's the case, they were already probably going to lose. In short, Cleansing doesn't do enough to be worth it most of the time. It is the card on this list that is the most widely played in EDH, and that's because it does have kind of a cool design because any player can choose to pay 1 life for any land in play, so you can offer to save your opponent's lands and stuff like that in exchange for something else. So it does make for an interesting sort of political card in EDH, but it is by no means good. Most of the time, it doesn't accomplish anything, and you end up spending 3 mana and a card for nothing. At number 3, it is Orcish Mine. This is another aura that can destroy an enchanted land, but like the others that made the list, it does so far too slowly. When it enchants a land, you put 3 ore counters on the mine, then during each upkeep, or when the enchanted land becomes tapped, you remove an ore counter. When it runs out of those counters, the land gets destroyed and its controller takes 2 damage. In short, unlike the other auras we saw on this list, this one can potentially allow your opponent to use their land 2 times before it gets destroyed, making it even worse. They lose 1 counter on their upkeep, then they can tap it for mana on their turn and go down to 1 ore counter. Then, before it loses the last ore counter on their next upkeep, they can tap it for mana again. Now, they do need something that is instant speed to spend that mana on, but that's not exactly a hard ask. Basically, this has no real impact on the game until the 3rd turn after you cast it, and even then the effect isn't likely to concern your opponent at all, who will probably be very glad you spent the mana and used up a card for something this weak. At number 2, it is Avalanche. This is an incredibly narrow land destruction spell that is way overcosted. For X, 2 generic and 2 red, it lets you destroy X target snowlands. So you have to pay 5 to hit your first snow-covered land, and while it does get a little more reasonable the higher up you go with X, there are far, far better ways to nuke a bunch of lands than this, and most of them aren't limited to only destroying snowlands. And sure, there are decks that are reliant on snowlands, and this can mess them up in theory, but even then, you aren't exactly getting a good deal. Basically, this hates on something that is a little too narrow, and even in the ideal situation, it isn't very impressive. I think even in a world where everyone played Snowlands, this still wouldn't be a good card, as turning it into a one-sided Armageddon would still be way too expensive. And at number 1, it's Erosion, the 4th land destruction aura to make the list. This one costs 3 blue mana and enchants a land. Then at the beginning of the upkeep of the enchanted land's controller, you destroy the land unless your opponent pays 1 generic mana or 1 life. At least with the other land destruction auras we looked at in this video, they do eventually destroy the land, With Erosion, that is far from guaranteed. Spending a card in 3 mana on this is miserable, since your opponent will almost always be able to completely ignore it since they are given 3 different options. Either they don't really need the land and they'll let it go, they'll have the extra mana and they'll pay for the cost, or they have so much life that they don't care about paying life. That makes this card effectively a blank piece of cardboard in most situations. So, those are my picks for the worst land destruction cards in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards because maybe you want to prove me wrong, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more lists that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron or a channel member. You can find ways to do both of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.